Have you ever wondered what happens when absolute power meets absolute brutality? Throughout history, tyrants have ruled with iron fists, crushing anyone who dared oppose them. But karma has a twisted sense of justice. The same cruelty they inflicted on others would eventually come back to haunt them in the most horrific ways imaginable. Today we're diving into the darkest chapters of history to uncover the most brutal, shocking, and downright terrifying deaths of history's worst tyrants. These aren't just stories about bad people meeting bad ends. These are tales of systematic torture, calculated revenge, and violence so extreme that even hardened historians struggle to describe them. By the end of this video, you'll understand why absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how that corruption ultimately destroys those who wield it. But first, let me give you a warning. What you're about to hear contains graphic descriptions of violence that would make even the most seasoned crime documentaries seem tame. By comparison, these tyrants didn't just die, they were systematically destroyed, piece by piece, in ways designed to maximize their suffering. If you're easily disturbed, now might be the time to click away for everyone else. Prepare yourself for a journey through the most savage endings in human history. So, the first tyrant we need to discuss ruled with such ruthless efficiency that his name became synonymous with systematic murder. This wasn't a leader who simply made harsh decisions during wartime. This was a man who orchestrated the deaths of millions of his own people through carefully planned famines, mass deportations, and execution quotas that his subordinates were required to meet or face death themselves. His paranoia knew no bounds. He executed his closest allies, his most trusted generals, and even members of his own family when he suspected the slightest hint of disloyalty. Prison camps stretched across his empire, filled with intellectuals, farmers, and anyone else who might pose a theoretical threat to his absolute control. The death toll from his reign reached numbers so staggering that historians still debate the exact count decades later. But the universe has a way of balancing the scales. This tyrant's end came not through heroic resistance or military defeat, but through something far more intimate and terrifying. The man who had controlled every aspect of his empire found himself completely helpless in his final hours, surrounded by the very people he had terrorized for decades. On the night of his death, he had been drinking heavily with his inner circle, the same men who lived in constant fear of his unpredictable rages. As the evening progressed, witnesses reported that he began experiencing severe abdominal pain. He collapsed in his private chambers, writhing in agony as blood began pouring from his mouth and nose. His loyal guards, trained to respond instantly to any threat against their leader, found themselves paralyzed with uncertainty. Was this a natural illness, or had someone finally succeeded in poisoning the man they were sworn to protect? More importantly, what would happen to them if he died on their watch? For hours, the tyrant lay convulsing on the floor of his bedroom while his subordinates stood frozen in terror. No one dared call for medical help without explicit orders, but no one could get coherent instructions from their dying leader. His speech became slurred and incomprehensible as foam mixed with blood continued streaming from his mouth. The most chilling detail came from his personal bodyguard, who later described the look of absolute terror in the tyrant's eyes. This was a man who had never shown fear in the face of warfare, assassination attempts, or international crises. But as he felt his body shutting down beyond his control, panic consumed him completely. His breathing became laboured and erratic. Witnesses reported hearing him making desperate gasping sounds as he struggled for air. The same man who had casually ordered the suffocation of countless prisoners now found himself slowly suffocating in his own bodily fluids. His hands clawed frantically at his throat, as if trying to clear an obstruction that existed only in his failing cardiovascular system. But perhaps the most fitting aspect of his death was the complete abandonment he experienced in those final moments. The men who had pledged their lives to serve him stood back and watched as he died alone on his bedroom floor. No one held his hand. No one offered comfort. They simply observed as their all-powerful leader was reduced to a helpless, terrified old man choking on his own blood. The irony wasn't lost on those present. This tyrant had built his empire on the principle that individual human lives meant nothing compared to the state's needs. He had personally signed execution orders for thousands of people, many of whom had begged for mercy in their final moments. Now he found himself in the same position, completely powerless and receiving the same cold indifference he had shown to countless others. As his breathing finally stopped, his subordinates remained frozen in place for several more minutes, afraid that any movement might somehow revive his wrath. Even in death, the fear he had cultivated continued to paralyze those around him. When word of his death finally spread throughout the empire, the reaction wasn't grief or mourning. It was pure chaos. The carefully constructed system of terror that had held his regime together for decades began collapsing within hours. Regional governors who had enforced his brutal policies suddenly found themselves targets of the same violence they had inflicted on others. Prison guards abandoned their posts as inmates realized their captors were no longer protected by an all-powerful leader. The execution squads that had carried out mass killings discovered that without their supreme commander's authority, they were nothing more than murderers surrounded by millions of victims' families seeking revenge. But our next tyrant's death makes the previous story seem almost merciful by comparison. This ruler controlled a vast empire through a network of secret police so efficient that neighbors regularly disappeared in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. Children were taught to report their own parents for expressing the wrong opinions. Teachers, doctors, and engineers vanished if they questioned government policies. His reign of terror lasted for over 2 decades, during which time he transformed his nation into a massive surveillance state where even private thoughts weren't sufficient. Citizens lived in constant fear that a casual comment or facial expression might be interpreted as treasonous. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones were sent to remote labour camps where starvation and exhaustion killed them slowly over months or years. This tyrant's obsession with control extended to the most intimate details of daily life. He dictated what books people could read, what music they could listen to, and even what they could discuss with their own families behind closed doors. Marriage partners were assigned based on political loyalty rather than personal choice. Children were separated from parents if their bloodlines were deemed problematic. His secret police operated with unlimited authority to torture confessions from suspected dissidents. Techniques included sleep deprivation lasting for weeks, electric shock treatments, and psychological torment designed to break the human spirit completely. Prisoners were forced to betray their closest friends and family members just to make the pain stop temporarily. The tyrant himself rarely witnessed these horrors directly, preferring to review written reports while dining on luxurious meals in his heavily fortified palace compound. He seemed to derive genuine pleasure from reading detailed accounts of his enemies' suffering, often requesting additional information about particularly brutal interrogations. His downfall began when his own intelligence apparatus turned against him. The same agents who had spent years perfecting methods of psychological torture decided their skills would be better applied to their former master. They had learned exactly which techniques caused maximum suffering while keeping victims conscious and aware throughout the process. The coup happened during a routine security briefing. His most trusted advisors surrounded him in his private office, weapons drawn and escape routes blocked. But instead of a quick assassination, they had something far more elaborate planned. They wanted him to experience every method of torment he had authorized against his own people. They began with sleep deprivation, keeping him awake for days using the same bright lights and loud noises his prisoners had endured. His captors took shifts, ensuring he couldn't rest even for a few minutes. When exhaustion finally broke down his psychological defenses, they moved to the next phase of his punishment. Isolation followed as they locked him in a windowless cell identical to the ones he had designed for political prisoners. The walls were bare concrete, the floor was freezing metal, and the only sounds were his own breathing and heartbeat echoing endlessly in the confined space. Days passed without human contact or any indication of what would happen next. The psychological pressure intensified when they began playing recordings of his victims' final words. Hour after hour, he listened to the voices of people he had ordered killed, begging for mercy that never came. Former prisoners who had survived his labor camps took turns describing their experiences in vivid detail through speakers mounted in his cell walls. When his mental state began deteriorating visibly, they introduced physical torture methods he had personally approved for use against dissidents. Electric currents sent through his body caused muscle spasms and burning pain that lasted for hours after each session ended. Waterboarding left him gasping and panicking as his lungs filled with liquid. But the cruelest aspect of his punishment was the false hope they repeatedly offered and then snatched away. Multiple times, his captors told him he would be released if he publicly confessed to his crimes and begged forgiveness from the families of his victims. Each time he complied, desperately grasping for any chance of survival, they laughed and informed him the torture would continue. These stories reveal a fundamental truth about power and its consequences. Every tyrant who has ever lived believed themselves untouchable, convinced that their reign of terror would last forever. They surrounded themselves with loyal followers, built elaborate security systems, and eliminated anyone who posed even the slightest threat. Yet history shows us that no amount of brutality can protect someone from the inevitable reckoning that follows a lifetime of cruelty. The deaths we've explored today weren't random acts of violence or simple assassinations. They were calculated expressions of justice, delivered by the very people who had suffered under these tyrants' rules. The same methods of torture, the same psychological warfare, the same systematic dehumanization that these rulers had perfected against their enemies ultimately became the instruments of their own destruction. What makes these endings so particularly chilling isn't just their brutality, but their precision. These weren't crimes of passion committed in moments of rage. They were carefully orchestrated punishments designed to give each tyrant a taste of the suffering they had inflicted on countless others. The hunters became the hunted, and the architects of terror discovered what it felt like to be completely helpless and abandoned. Perhaps the most disturbing lesson from these historical accounts is how quickly absolute power can evaporate. Men who controlled entire empires, who commanded armies and secret police forces, who seemed invincible just hours before their deaths, found themselves utterly defenseless when their carefully constructed systems of fear finally collapsed around them. These stories serve as eternal reminders that no one is above the consequences of their actions, no matter how powerful they may seem in the moment.